The story begins, as many important stories do, not in a grand castle or a bustling city, but in a place of quiet sorrow, in a small, stone-built cottage on the very outskirts of a village that itself seemed to cling to the side of the rolling, green hills as if for comfort. This was the home of a young boy named Elian and his mother, Anya. And if you were to walk past this cottage on a sunny afternoon, you might notice the neat little garden out front, or the tendril of smoke curling from its chimney, and you might think it a picture of perfect, peaceful simplicity. But you would be wrong, for the truest essence of this home was not in its stone walls or its thatched roof, but in the heavy, silent air that filled its rooms, an air thick with a sadness so profound it had a weight and a presence all its own. This sadness belonged to Anya. There was a time, and it felt to Elian like a time from a storybook he had once been read, that his mother was the very heart of joy. He could almost remember, in the fuzzy way one remembers a dream, the sound of her laughter. It wasn't just an ordinary laugh. It was a sound that seemed to sparkle and dance on the air, a melody that could make you smile even if you didn't know the joke. Her eyes, he recalled, used to shine with a light that was brighter than the lantern they lit each evening. She would sweep him into her arms, and her embrace was warm and sure, a fortress against any childhood fear. But that woman, that laughing, shining woman, had slowly faded away, like a beautiful painting left out in the sun and the rain, its colors washing away until only a ghost of the image remained. The woman who sat by the hearth now was a quiet echo of that past self. Her shoulders were perpetually stooped, not under a physical weight, but under the immense, invisible burden of a heart that had been broken too many times. She moved through her days with a slow, careful deliberation, as if every action, from stirring the stew in the pot to lifting a cup of water to her lips, required a great effort of will. Her eyes, which had once been so bright, were now pools of a deep and weary sorrow. They would often gaze out the small window, not seeing the birds flitting past or the clouds drifting by, but looking inward at some private, painful memory that Elian could not see. The boy, with the keen perception that children possess, knew his mother was sick. He didn't understand the nature of this sickness, for she never coughed or sneezed or ran a fever. This was a sickness of the spirit, a deep wound on her soul that no bandage could cover. He had overheard the whispers of the village women when they thought he wasn't listening. Their words were like sharp little stones. "Poor Anya," they would murmur, their voices a mixture of pity and a strange, almost fearful respect for the magnitude of her suffering. Life has beaten her down 100 times over. 100 cruel words, 100 harsh turns of fate. A spirit can only take so much. She will never heal from that. Some cracks run too deep to ever be mended. These words carved themselves into Elian's young heart. Never heal. The finality of it was a terrifying thing. He loved his mother with a fierce and desperate love, and the idea that she would forever be this shadow, this ghost of herself, was a pain he could scarcely bear. And so, he became a little soldier in a war against this invisible enemy. He would venture into the meadows and return with fistfuls of the brightest wildflowers, their yellow and blue faces turned up to the sun, and he would present them to her with a hopeful smile. She would take them, her fingers brushing his, and she would whisper, "Thank you, my darling." But her eyes would remain distant, and the flowers would be placed in a jar of water, their beauty seemingly unable to pierce the gloom that surrounded her. He would draw pictures for her, crude but heartfelt crayon sketches of their little house with a huge sun smiling in the sky above it, or the two of them holding hands. She would pin these drawings to the wall, a gallery of his love, but the sadness in her face did not lift. He tried telling her jokes he'd heard from the other children, but his words seemed to fall to the floor at her feet, lifeless and ineffective. It was like trying to warm a frozen lake by blowing on it with your own breath. The effort was heartfelt, but the ice was miles thick. With each failed attempt, a little piece of Elian's own hope chipped away. He felt a profound and aching loneliness, a feeling of being utterly alone in his mission to save the person he loved most in the world. He was adrift on a sea of her sorrow, in a small boat with no oars, watching his beautiful mama slowly disappear into a mist he could not dispel. He did not know what to do, and that was the heaviest weight of all. The weight of helplessness is a peculiar and profound burden for a child to carry, a leaden feeling in the chest that makes the bright sun seem dimmer and the songs of birds sound like mournful cries. For young Elian, this feeling had become his constant, unwelcome companion, a shadow that trailed him even within the walls of his own home. The sight of his mother, Anya, sitting so still and so sad by the window, a figure of such deep, quiet grief, was a puzzle he could not solve, a locked door for which he possessed no key. The cheerful efforts, the flowers and the drawings, that had once felt like powerful magic, now felt foolish and childish, mere pebbles tossed against a fortress wall. The whispered verdict of the village women, "She will never heal," echoed in his mind, not as a mere prediction, but as a sentence, a final and unchangeable truth that left him feeling small and utterly alone in the entire world. It was on an afternoon when this feeling of solitude had grown so vast it seemed to swallow him whole that Elian found himself wandering away from the cottage, past the last of the neat garden plots, and beyond the final, familiar lane of the village. His feet, seemingly of their own accord, carried him toward the wild, open space where the ordered world of men gave way to the untamed embrace of nature. He came to a place where an old, weathered wooden fence, silvered by sun and bleached by rain, marked the boundary between the known and the unknown. Beyond it stretched immense, rolling fields of green and gold, a kingdom of grass and sky that seemed to go on forever, under a great dome of endless blue. The air here smelled different. It was clean and sharp, carrying the scent of earth and wild time and freedom. With a sigh that seemed to come from the very depths of his small soul, Elian hoisted himself up to sit on the top rail of the old fence, his legs dangling down. He gripped the weathered wood with his hands and squinted his eyes against the sun, imagining himself not as a sad boy from a sad cottage, but as a brave cowboy on a great ranch, a lone hero astride a powerful horse. In his mind, he was a figure of strength and purpose, someone who could face any danger, solve any problem, and rescue anyone in trouble. He would ride across this vast expanse and confront the monstrous, formless thing that had stolen his mother's joy, and he would defeat it with courage and force. But the daydream, as vivid as it was, could not hold. The image of his mother's sorrowful face would always intrude, and the heroic fantasy would crumble, leaving him once again as just a small boy on a fence, powerless against a pain he could not see or touch or fight. He was so lost in this cycle of hope and despair that he did not immediately notice the man who was working a little way down the fence line. The man was tall and lean, dressed in clothes the color of dust and earth, and he moved with a slow, deliberate economy of motion that spoke of a deep familiarity with hard work. He was mending a broken section of the fence, his strong, capable hands pulling a length of wire taut and securing it with a twist. This was Caleb, a man who lived in a small, solitary cabin deeper in the hills, a man who cared for a small herd of horses and who rarely came into the village except for supplies. The villagers, in their way, had a name for him, as people often do for those who walk a different path. They called him the Lonely Cowboy, not out of meanness, but because he was always alone and seemed to prefer it that way. His silence was not seen as sullen, but as thoughtful, his solitude not as friendlessness, but as a choice. Caleb had been aware of the boy's presence for some time. He had seen the small figure trudging across the field, shoulders slumped, and had watched him climb onto the fence. He had seen the boy's face, pale and drawn, with a worry far too old for his years, and he had recognized the posture of a heart carrying a weight it did not know how to put down. After finishing his task, Caleb wiped his hands on his trousers and walked slowly toward the boy, his boots making almost no sound on the soft grass. He did not speak at first, simply leaning against the fence post a little ways from Elian and gazing out at the same vast view, sharing the silence as if it were a language they both understood. After a long, comfortable moment, Caleb's voice, when it finally came, was a low, gentle rumble like distant thunder on a summer night, not frightening but calm and steadying. "That's a mighty heavy sigh for such a young cowboy," he said, his eyes still on the horizon. "Seems to me you're carrying a burden bigger than your saddlebags can hold." Startled from his thoughts, Elian turned to look at the man. He knew who Caleb was, had seen him in the village square, a quiet figure who moved through the crowds like a river stone, solid and undisturbed. There was a kindness in the man's weathered face, in the crinkles at the corners of his eyes, that invited confidence. The simple observation, spoken without pity or intrusion, unlocked something inside Elian. The words he had been holding back, the fear and the frustration, came tumbling out in a helpless rush. "It's my mama," he said, his voice thick with emotion. She's sick inside. I try to help. I bring her flowers and I try to make her laugh, but nothing works. She's just so sad. All the time." He looked down at his hands, his small fingers gripping the fence rail until his knuckles were white. "The women in the village, they say life has beaten her 100 times. They say she's too hurt, that she'll never heal." He spoke the terrible words aloud, giving voice to the fear that had taken root in his heart, making it real in the vastness of the open field. Caleb listened, not interrupting, his full attention on the boy. He nodded slowly, a deep understanding in his gaze. He looked out across his land, at the horses grazing peacefully in the distance, and then back to Elian. "They might be right about the 100 beatings," he said, his voice still low and even. "Life can be mighty hard, and some folks get more than their fair share of hardship. It leaves a mark. But they're wrong about one thing." He turned his head and met Elian's worried eyes. "The deepest hurts, the ones that aren't on the outside where a bandage can fix them, they're a different kind of injury. They're wounds on the heart, on the spirit. And for those, you need a different kind of medicine altogether. The strongest medicine there is." The words hung in the air between them, a tantalizing, almost magical possibility that seemed to shimmer in the afternoon light. A different kind of medicine. To Elian, whose world had been reduced to the binary of sick and well, broken and fixed, the concept was as foreign and intriguing as a map to a hidden country. His young mind, so desperate for a solution, immediately conjured images of secret herbal potions brewed under the moonlight, of enchanted springs hidden deep in the forest, of a mystical cure that could be administered in a single miraculous dose. He leaned forward on the weathered fence rail, his earlier despair momentarily forgotten, replaced by a spark of desperate hope. His brow furrowed in confusion at the rancher's simple statement. What other medicine could there possibly be? Their village healer had jars of salves and bundles of dried herbs for fevers and aches, but everyone knew they were useless against the sickness that lived in his mother's quiet sighs and distant gaze. "What medicine?" Elian asked, his voice a mixture of skepticism and yearning. He gestured vaguely toward the village behind them. "We have no magic potions. There's no special leaf or root that fixes a broken heart. I've asked." The admission was filled with the memory of that helplessness, of being told by well-meaning adults that time was the only healer, a concept as vast and infuriatingly slow as the growth of a mountain. Caleb's response was not to offer a vial or point to a rare plant. Instead, a slow, deep smile touched his lips, a smile that held no mystery but rather an immense and patient wisdom. It was the smile of a man who understood the rhythms of the earth, of seasons that turned not because they were rushed, but because it was their nature to do so. He shook his head gently, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "The strongest medicine isn't magic, son," he said, his voice as steady and reassuring as the earth beneath their feet. "It doesn't come from a bottle or a pouch. Its power isn't in being rare or secret. Its power is in its nature. The medicine for a wounded spirit is gentleness. It's patience. It's the creating of a safe harbor in a world that has been nothing but storm." He paused, letting the simplicity of the words settle. They sounded so plain, so ordinary next to the grand, heroic solutions Elian had imagined for himself. How could mere gentleness stand against 100 beatings? How could patience fight an enemy as vast as his mother's sadness? It seemed like bringing a spoon to dig a mine. Seeing the doubt still etched on the boy's face, Caleb knew he needed to show, not just tell. He turned his gaze from Elian and looked out across his land, his eyes scanning the expanse of green and gold until they settled on a specific point. He lifted a hand, his finger pointing with a quiet certainty. You see that young filly over there? The one standing apart, near the cluster of birch trees? Elian followed his gaze and saw her. She was a beautiful creature, all long, slender legs and a coat the color of rich chestnuts. But there was a tension in her posture that was unmistakable. She was not grazing peacefully like the others. Her head was held high, her ears flicking nervously at every sound, her whole body poised for flight. She took a tentative step, then froze, her large, dark eyes wide with a perpetual alarm. She's beautiful, Elian whispered, captivated by her nervous grace. She is, Caleb agreed, his voice dropping to a near whisper, as if he too were afraid of spooking her. But she's also terrified. She came to me from a place where she was treated with fear and harshness. Her spirit was beaten down, not with sticks perhaps, but with shouts and impatience and rough hands. She learned that people meant danger, that the world was not a safe place. He let the image of the skittish animal sink in, a living, breathing example of a spirit that had been wounded. Now, son, think. If I were to decide today that I needed her to be calm, that I needed her to trust me right now, what would happen if I marched out into that field toward her? If I called out to her, or worse, ran at her waving my arms to corral her? Elian didn't have to think hard. The answer was obvious in the animal's every trembling muscle. She'd run away, he said softly. She'd be more scared than ever. Exactly, Caleb said, his voice firm with conviction. My strength, my impatience, my desire for a quick fix, all of it would be just another beating. It would prove her every fear was right. I would be just another loud, frightening thing in a world full of them. I would be deepening the wound, not healing it. He let the silence stretch for a moment, allowing the lesson to take root. The breeze rustled the grass, and the filly in the distance took another nervous, mincing step. So what did you do? Elian asked, his voice full of a new, dawning curiosity. The heroic fantasy of the cowboy charging in was fading, replaced by this far more quiet, more difficult strategy. I did nothing, Caleb said, and the simplicity of it was shocking. And everything. I began by just being nearby. I didn't look directly at her. A direct gaze can feel like a threat to a scared creature. I sat on this very fence like you are now. I went about my mending, my chores, but I did them quietly. I spoke to my other horses in a soft, low voice, so she could get used to the sound of it from a distance. I moved slowly, predictably, so my movements wouldn't surprise her. Every day I was just there, a calm, quiet presence that meant no harm. I let her watch me. I let her learn, at her own pace, that my presence did not bring danger. He turned to look at Elian, his gaze intense and meaningful. And some days, it seemed like nothing was happening. She would still startle at a bird taking flight. She'd still keep her distance. It was frustrating. I wanted to just go to her to show her I was friendly. But I didn't, because this wasn't about what I wanted. It was about what she needed. It was about proving, through endless patience, that I could be trusted. It took many, many days. It's still taking days. Healing, he said, finishing with a weight that settled over Elian like a blanket, is not a race. It is the slow, steady drip of water that eventually wears away stone. A profound and heavy silence descended upon the two figures on the fence, a silence that was not empty but filled to bursting with the immensity of the lesson just imparted. For Elian, the world seemed to tilt on its axis, its colors shifting and rearranging into a new, unfamiliar pattern. The heroic, charging cowboy of his daydreams, the one who fought monsters with a loud yell and a strong sword, dissolved in a mist, revealed as a childish fantasy utterly useless for the real battle he faced. In his mind's eye, he saw not a monster to be slain, but his mother's fragile, wounded spirit, as skittish and poised for flight as the chestnut filly in the field. He saw his own past efforts for what they truly were, not the gentle, patient presence Caleb described, but a series of anxious, frantic charges. He had been waving bright flowers and telling cheerful jokes like flags, trying to force a change, to make her happy, and in doing so, he realized with a sinking heart, he might have been just another startling, frightening presence in her world of shadows, another demand on a spirit that had no strength left to give. The understanding was a humbling, almost frightening revelation. It meant that everything he had instinctively done, every tool in his small emotional toolkit, was not just ineffective but potentially part of the problem. The solution was not to do more, but to be different. The medicine was not an action, but a state of being. It was a path that required a strength he wasn't sure he possessed. Not the strength of force, but the strength of endless calm, of bottomless patience. It required a kind of courage that felt foreign. The courage to be still, to be quiet, to trust in a process so slow its progress would be invisible from day to day. He looked inward and saw only his own impatience, his own desperate desire for a quick fix, his own fear that the village women were right, that never was a real and final destination. How could he, a boy who fidgeted through long sermons and counted the minutes until a game was over, possibly embody the timeless, unwavering patience of the man beside him? He felt very small again, but the feeling was different now. It was not the smallness of helplessness, but the smallness of standing at the edge of a vast, unknown ocean, understanding the depth of the waters he was being asked to sail. He turned his head and looked at Caleb, the lonely cowboy, whose quiet strength seemed as solid and permanent as the hills themselves. The man's eyes were still on the distant filly, but Elian knew his attention was entirely on the boy beside him, waiting without pressure, offering without demanding. The question, when it finally came, was barely a whisper, a fragile thing offered into the vastness of the field. "Will you help me?" Elian asked, his voice thick with a vulnerability he had never shown anyone before. He was not asking for a potion or a secret word. He was asking for guidance into a new way of existing. I don't know how to be that gentle. I don't know if I could be that patient. What if I get it wrong? What if I get frustrated and scare her more? The fears tumbled out, each one a confession of his own perceived inadequacy for this monumental task. Caleb slowly turned his gaze from the horizon and looked down at Elian. There was no judgment in his eyes, no disappointment at the boy's admission of doubt. Instead, there was a deep and abiding understanding, the look of a man who had himself stood at this same precipice, who knew the weight of the promise he was about to ask for. He did not offer empty reassurance. He did not say, "Of course you can," or "It will be easy." He treated the boy's request with the gravity it deserved. He shifted his position on the fence, turning his body fully toward Elian, his movements still slow and deliberate. He placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, not a pat of dismissal, but a steadying, grounding weight. His hand was calloused and strong from years of work, yet its touch was incredibly gentle. "I will help you," he said, and the words were a vow, simple and unbreakable. "I will be here. You can come and tell me how it goes. We can watch the horses together and remember." But then his expression grew even more serious, his eyes holding Elian's with an intensity that the boy would remember for the rest of his life. "But the journey itself, son, that you must walk on your own. And it begins not with a step, but with a promise. A promise you must make to yourself and to her before you even go back into that house." The air grew still. The birds seemed to hush their singing. "What promise?" Elian asked, his heart beating a little faster. "You must promise," Caleb said, his voice low and clear, every word etched into the quiet afternoon, "to be gentle every single step of the way. Not just when it's easy, not just when you see a little progress. You must promise to be gentle even when you see no change at all. You must promise to be gentle when you feel sad yourself, when you feel angry that this is so hard, when you feel hopeless and want to give up. You must promise that your voice will stay soft, your movements will stay calm, and your heart will stay open, especially on the days when her sadness feels like a wall you cannot climb. This is not a promise for a day or a week. This is a promise for as long as it takes. It was the biggest, most solemn thing anyone had ever asked of Elian. It was a vow of monumental patience, a commitment to a strength he wasn't sure he had. He looked into the cowboy's steady, unwavering eyes that had seen seasons change and wounds slowly heal, and he saw the reflection of the man he would need to become to keep such a promise. He took a deep, shuddering breath, filling his lungs with the clean, honest air of the field. He thought of his mother's sorrowful eyes, and he found, to his own surprise, that the desire to help her was far greater than his fear of failing. He nodded, a single decisive movement. "I promise," he said, and his voice, though young, did not waver. "I will be gentle every step." The words hung in the air, a sacred oath spoken between a boy, a man, and the wide, listening sky. It was the end of his old way of trying, and the beginning of something new, something fragile and brave, and filled with a hope that was quiet, patient, and true. The walk back from the fence line to the small stone cottage was unlike any journey Elian had ever taken. It was not a long distance, a path his feet had trodden 1,000 times before, often at a run, often with a mind full of boyish concerns or simple joys. But this time, he moved with a new and profound slowness, each step a conscious, measured act. The world around him seemed to have shifted into sharper focus, as if he were seeing it through a lens polished by the solemnity of the promise he had just made. He noticed the individual blades of grass bending under his feet, the intricate architecture of a spider's web glistening with dew in the low afternoon sun, the distant call of a single bird that seemed to ring with a clear, pure note in the vast silence. His mind, usually a whirlwind of plans and imaginings, was preternaturally still, turned entirely inward, rehearsing the tenets of this new, gentle philosophy he was now sworn to uphold. He paused at the familiar wooden gate, his hand resting on its sun-warmed surface. From here, he could see the window of the main room, and through it, the faint, motionless outline of his mother, Anya, sitting in her usual chair. Just days before, the sight would have sent a jolt of anxious energy through him, a desperate need to rush inside and do something, to perform some small act that might, by miracle, lift the gloom for even a second. Now he simply watched. He observed the slump of her shoulders, the way her hands lay limp in her lap, the absolute stillness that was less like peace and more like an exhaustion so deep it had settled into her very bones. He saw her not as a problem to be solved, but as a person to be understood. A creature, like Caleb's filly, who had learned that the world was a source of pain and was now waiting, braced, for the next blow to fall. He opened the gate, not with its usual creaking slam, but with a careful, deliberate lift, easing it shut behind him without a sound. He crossed the garden path, his footsteps soft on the packed earth. He did not burst through the door with a cheerful, forced announcement of his return. Instead, he opened it slowly, allowing the hinge to sigh rather than complain. The interior of the cottage was dim and cool, the air still holding the heavy, sorrowful quality that had become its norm. Anya did not look up at his entrance. She remained by the window, her gaze turned inward to her private landscape of memory and ache. Elian did not go to her. He did not bring her a flower or present a drawing. He did not fill the silence with chatter about his day. He simply took off his worn shoes and placed them neatly by the door, a small, quiet act of order. He walked into the room and, instead of going directly to his mother, he went to the corner where a small, wooden box of his toys and blocks sat. He had not built with them in an age, feeling himself too old for such childish things, too burdened by adult worries. Now he saw them not as toys, but as tools. He sat on the floor, a little distance from her chair, and began to take out the smooth, sanded blocks of wood. He did not build a tall, ambitious tower destined for a dramatic collapse. He began to lay out a simple, steady foundation on the rug, placing each block with a focused, quiet attention. His movements were slow, his breathing even. He was not building for a result. He was building as an act of being, He was simply there, a calm, quiet presence in the room, a presence that asked for nothing, demanded nothing, expected nothing. He hummed, very softly, not a recognizable tune but a low, steady, wordless melody, a sound as natural and unthreatening as the hum of bees outside the window. It was not performed for her benefit. It was simply a sound that accompanied his quiet work, a vibration of peaceful intent that he offered to the atmosphere of the room. Minutes stretched into a quarter hour, and then a half. Anya did not move. She did not speak. The only change was almost imperceptible. The terrifying, brittle tension that usually held her body rigid, the sense of her being a vase balanced on the very edge of a shelf, seemed to lessen by a fraction of a degree. It was not that she relaxed. It was that she was perhaps, for the first time in a long time, not actively bracing herself. The frantic, cheerful boy who usually tried to distract her was gone, replaced by this quiet, focused presence that asked nothing of her. It was a novelty so strange, it was almost peaceful. On another day, he simply sat on the floor near her feet and read a book, turning the pages with a soft rustle. On another, he worked quietly at the small table, mending a tear in his shirt with clumsy but patient stitches. He began to notice the small rhythms of her days, the time she liked a cup of tea, the way she sometimes glanced toward the garden. He would, without speaking, place a cup of tea on the small table beside her chair when the afternoon light reached a certain angle on the floorboards. He did not ask if she wanted it. He did not wait for a thank you. He simply placed it there, a quiet offering, and returned to his own quiet pursuits. There were moments of intense frustration for Elian. Days where the silence felt like a weight threatening to crush him. Days where he desperately wanted to shake her and beg her to come back to him. Days where the promise to be gentle felt like a chain holding him back from real action. He would look at her still, sad face, and feel a surge of that old, desperate impatience. In those moments, he would remember his promise. He would close his eyes and picture Caleb's face, the image of the rancher sitting on the fence, doing nothing and everything. He would take a deep, slow breath, let the frustration wash through him, and then let it go, exhaling it into the quiet room. He would return to his blocks, his mending, his quiet sitting. He was learning that gentleness was not a passive state, but an active discipline. It was a constant, conscious choice to override one's own impulses, to prioritize another's fragile peace over one's own desire for a solution. He was building block by patient block, a foundation of safety not just for her, but for himself. He was learning the architecture of peace, one quiet, gentle step at a time. The season began its slow, inevitable turn, the fierce green of high summer, softening into the golden, drowsy hues of early autumn. The change was subtle, a gradual cooling of the evening air, a faint gilding at the very edges of the leaves on the oak tree outside the cottage. Inside the stone walls, a different kind of change was occurring, one so slow and delicate that to an outside observer, it might have seemed like no change at all. For Elian, the days had settled into the rhythm of his promise, a rhythm as steady and patient as the beating of his own heart. The initial, conscious effort of each gentle action, the quiet opening of the door, the slow placement of a block, the soft hum, had begun to seep into his very nature. It was becoming less of a strategy and more of a way of being, a new language he was learning to speak fluently, a language whose only words were patience, presence, and peace. He had long since stopped looking for immediate results. The hope he carried now was not a bright, flashing thing that demanded satisfaction, but a low, steady ember that glowed with the simple rightness of his actions. He found a strange comfort in the routine itself, in the act of tending to this quiet space he was creating, much like Caleb tended his fields, without demand for a specific harvest. He would work in the small garden, pulling weeds with careful hands, loosening the soil around the late-blooming flowers. His movements were economical and calm, his whole attention on the task, on the feel of the earth, the scent of the damp soil, the warmth of the sun on his back. He was, in these moments, not a boy trying to heal his mother, but simply a boy existing in a state of gentle harmony with the world immediately around him. It was on one such afternoon that the shift occurred, a moment so small, so seemingly insignificant, that it would have been missed by anyone not attuned to the microscopic landscape of Anya's sorrow. Elian was carefully watering the hardy chrysanthemums that bloomed in a defiant burst of copper and gold against the coming chill. He held the watering can with both hands, tipping it just so to provide a gentle shower, not a disruptive flood. He was focused entirely on the task, his mind quiet, his promise a part of his breath and his bones. He felt, more than heard, a presence behind him. It was not the usual feeling of being alone in the house, with his mother's silent grief. This was a different quality of attention. Slowly, so, as not to startle the moment away, he finished watering the last plant and set the can down. He turned, and there she was. Anya was standing just inside the doorway, one hand resting on the frame. She was not looking out at the hills or lost in some inward vision. She was looking directly at him. Her posture was still frail, her face still etched with the lines of her suffering. But her eyes were different. They were present. They were focused on him, on his hands, on the watered plants. And in the depths of those weary, beautiful eyes, there was the smallest, faintest flicker of light. It was not the brilliant, laughing light of the past, but a new light, a tiny, fragile candle flame sputtering to life in a vast darkness. And at the corners of her mouth, almost hidden by the shadows of her pain, was the unmistakable, tremulous beginning of a smile. It was a ghost of a smile, a mere suggestion of upward curvature, but it was real. It was there. Elian's breath caught in his throat. A jolt of pure, undiluted joy shot through him. A lightning bolt of hope so powerful it threatened to shatter the gentle calm he had so carefully cultivated. Every instinct screamed at him to react, to run to her, to shout, "Mama!" You smiled, to point at the miracle and celebrate it, to demand that it grow and stay. It was the old way, the way of frantic action, the way of trying to grasp at happiness and hold it tight. But he did not. He remembered the skittish filly. He remembered his promise. Every single step, even this one, especially this one, a loud reaction, a sudden movement, could be just another startling wave, frightening that tiny, newborn flame into extinction. So, he did something that required more strength than any heroic charge. He stood very still. He met her gaze, and onto his own face, he carefully, consciously, placed a gentle smile of his own. It was a smile not of triumph, but of quiet recognition. A smile that said, "I see you. I am here, and it is okay." He held her gaze for a long, soft moment, and then, slowly, he turned back to the garden and picked up a stray leaf that had fallen on the path, his movements still calm, still measured. He gave the moment space to breathe. He did not crowd it. He did not demand more. The moment passed. Anya's faint smile faded, but the new light in her eyes did not completely vanish. She did not speak, but after a moment, she turned and moved back into the cottage. Her step seemed just a fraction less heavy. Days later, another miracle occurred, one that was just as quiet and just as profound. Elian was on the floor, once again working on his block construction. He was building a wider, more complex structure now, a quiet fortress of his own making. He was so absorbed in the placement of a particularly tricky cornerstone that he didn't hear her approach. He only became aware of her when a shadow fell over his blocks. He looked up. Anya was standing beside him. She looked down at his creation, her expression unreadable. Then, slowly, as if the movement required great thought and effort, she lowered herself to sit on the floor beside him. She did not look at him. She did not speak. She simply reached out a pale, slender hand, selected a single, smooth block from the pile, and with infinite care, placed it on top of his structure. It was not a grand gesture. It was a whisper of participation, a silent offering, a single, gentle step out of the fortress of her own solitude and into the quiet world he had been building for her, one patient block at a time. The transformation that unfolded within the stone walls of the cottage was not one of dramatic events or sweeping declarations. It was a change as gradual and natural as the turning of the earth, a slow, almost imperceptible shift in the very quality of the air they breathed. The deep, frozen winter of Anya's sorrow did not suddenly crack and melt into a glorious spring. Instead, it was a gradual thaw, the silent retreat of a glacier that had seemed permanent, leaving behind not a flood, but the first, tender shoots of new life pushing their way through once barren ground. The tiny, flickering smile that had appeared that day in the doorway did not vanish. It became a little less rare, a little less tremulous. It would appear sometimes when Elian was humming his soft, wordless tunes, or when she took the first sip of the tea he had placed beside her, still warm from the pot. It was a fragile thing, this new growth, and both of them, in their own ways, treated it with a kind of reverent care. Anya began, slowly, to emerge from the chair by the window that had been both her refuge and her prison. She did not suddenly become the vibrant woman of Elian's faded memories, but she began to move through the small rooms with a new purpose. She would sometimes stand at the doorway, like she had that first time, and simply feel the sun on her face. She began to take notice of the world outside the glass pane, the industrious journey of a ladybug along a stem, the pattern of rain on the stones, the way the evening star appeared in the same corner of the sky each night. She was relearning the world, not as a place of threat and pain, but as a place that could also hold simple, quiet beauties. The heavy blanket of her grief was still there, but it was no longer smothering her. She was learning to carry its weight, and in doing so, she found it grew a little lighter each day. Elian continued his quiet work, his promise now woven into the fabric of his days. He saw the changes in his mother not as a victory to be celebrated, but as a tender plant to be nurtured. He understood that a sudden noise, a raised voice, a moment of impatience could still startle this delicate healing process. His gentleness became his strength, a quiet power that required more courage and discipline than any show of force ever could. He learned the language of peaceful coexistence with pain, understanding that healing was not the erasure of a wound, but the growth of new life around it. He watched his mother with the same patient observation that Caleb employed with his horses, learning her rhythms, her quiet signals, respecting the days when the sadness lay heavier upon her, and offering his calm presence without demand. Then came an evening that would be etched into Elian's heart forever. The harvest moon, vast and golden, had risen over the hills, bathing the world in a soft, magical light. The last of the sunlight had faded from the sky, leaving it a deep, velvety blue. Father and son sat together on the bench outside their cottage, wrapped in the cool, clean air of the approaching night, watching the stars begin to prick through the darkness. The silence between them was not empty or sad. It was a comfortable, shared silence, filled with the chirping of crickets and the distant, low call of an owl. Elian was looking up at the moon, tracing the patterns on its surface, feeling a deep and profound peace settle over him. A soft sound beside him made him turn. Anya was looking at him, her face pale and beautiful in the moonlight. Her eyes, which had for so long been wells of bottomless sorrow, now held a different moisture, one of gratitude and a love so deep it needed no words. The silence stretched, filled only with the night sounds, and then she spoke. Her voice was not the strong, laughing voice of the past, nor was it the broken whisper of her deepest pain. It was a new voice, soft and clear, like a bell that had been carefully cleaned and polished after years of disuse. "Thank you, my sweet boy," she said. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken emotions. She reached out and took his small, calloused hand in her own, her grip surprisingly firm. "Your gentle heart," she continued, her gaze holding his, "is healing mine." In that moment, under the vast, star-dusted sky, Elian understood everything. He felt the truth of the Lonely Cowboy's lesson settle into his soul, not as a concept, but as a lived experience. He knew that you could not fight a hurt heart with force. You could not shout its sadness to make it leave. You could not demand that grief hurry its journey. True strength, the only kind of strength that mattered in the end, was found in the quiet, endless reservoir of love. It was found in the courage to be patient, the discipline to be kind, and the wisdom to make a promise to be gentle every single step of the way. He had not cured his mother. He had not defeated her sadness in a battle. He had simply, patiently, and gently offered her a safe place to heal herself. And he knew, with a certainty as solid as the earth beneath his feet, that this kind of strength could heal almost anything. We're so glad you joined Elian and Anya on their journey of gentle healing. If this story touched your heart, please let us know by giving it a like. Subscribe to our channel so you don't miss our next tale of courage and kindness. And if you know someone who might need a reminder of the power of a gentle heart, please share this story with them. Thank you for watching.